The October rain fell in steady sheets across Millbrook General Hospital, each droplet carrying the weight of autumn's promise and winter's warning. Dr. Samuel Hayes stood at the third-floor window, his stethoscope draped around his neck like a familiar companion, watching the world blur beyond the glass. He had always found comfort in rain. The way it washed things clean, gave the earth permission to start over. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. At 34, Samuel possessed the kind of quiet strength that drew people in rather than commanded attention. His colleagues respected him not for his volume, but for his precision, not for his ambition, but for his unwavering dedication to healing. He spoke in measured tones, chose his words carefully, and had a way of making patients feel heard, even in their darkest moments. The emergency department buzzed with its usual controlled chaos below, but up here in the neurology wing, silence held a different meaning. Samuel had spent 7 years specializing in communication disorders, drawn to the intricate mysteries of the human brain and its capacity for both trauma and recovery. Each case taught him something new about resilience, about the countless ways people found to connect when traditional paths were blocked. His phone buzzed against the windowsill, a text from Dr. Patricia Manning, the hospital's chief of staff. New patient coming up from ER, complex case, your expertise is needed. Samuel pocketed the device and straightened his white coat, feeling that familiar stirring of curiosity that came with each new challenge. The elevator carried him downward through the hospital's layers of organized urgency. Emergency rooms had their own rhythm, their own language of beeping monitors and hurried footsteps. Samuel navigated through the maze of curtained areas, past residents discussing treatment plans and nurses coordinating care with practiced efficiency. Found Dr. Manning near bed 7, her silver hair pulled back in its characteristic bun, reading charts with the focused intensity that had earned her a reputation as one of the finest physicians in the state. She looked up as he approached, her expression carrying that particular weight that came with difficult cases. "Samuel, thank you for coming down so quickly." Her voice held both professional courtesy and genuine concern. "We have a 26-year-old woman brought in by social services. Found her this morning sitting outside St. Catherine's Church, apparently there all night in the rain." Samuel studied the chart she handed him, scanning the preliminary notes. Physical injuries. Superficial. Cuts on her hands, likely from broken glass. Severely dehydrated, malnourished, but Samuel... Dr. Manning paused, choosing her words carefully. "She hasn't spoken a word since arrival. Won't write, won't nod, won't even make eye contact. The social worker believes she may have experienced significant trauma." Through the partially drawn curtain, Samuel caught his first glimpse of the woman who would change everything he thought he knew about healing. She sat perfectly still on the edge of the hospital bed, her dark hair hanging like a veil around her face, hospital gown dwarfing her slight frame. Her hands were folded in her lap, bandaged where the glass had cut them, and she stared at a fixed point on the floor as if the entire world had narrowed to that single spot. Something in her posture spoke of profound exhaustion, not just physical, but the kind of bone-deep weariness that came from carrying burdens too heavy for one person to bear alone. Yet there was something else, something in the careful way she held herself that suggested strength buried beneath layers of pain. "Any identification?" Samuel asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "None. No purse, no wallet, no phone." The clothes she was wearing were donated from the church's clothing drive, mismatched, worn thin. Whoever she is, wherever she came from, she arrived with nothing but the silence she's wrapped around herself like armor. Samuel approached the bedside slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. He had learned over the years that healing often began with presence rather than words, with the simple act of bearing witness to another person's pain without judgment or expectation. "Hello," he said softly, positioning himself where she could see him without having to lift her head. "Oh, my name is Dr. Hayes. I work with people who have difficulty communicating, and I'd like to help if I can." She didn't respond, didn't even flicker an acknowledgement that she'd heard him. But Samuel noticed the almost imperceptible tightening of her shoulders, the way her breathing shifted slightly. She was listening, processing, making calculations about safety and threat that trauma survivors knew by instinct. The silence stretched between them, but Samuel had learned to be comfortable with silence. It was often where the most important conversations began, in the spaces between words, in the careful observation of what wasn't being said as much as what was. "I'm going to sit here for a moment," he said, settling into the plastic chair beside her bed. "You don't need to talk to me or look at me. I just want you to know that you're safe now, and no one here is going to ask you to be anyone other than exactly who you are right now." Minutes passed. The hospital continued its constant symphony of activity around them, distant conversations, the squeak of wheels on linoleum, the electronic beeps and chirps that marked the passage of time in places where time often meant the difference between life and death. But in this small curtained space, time moved differently, measured not in minutes but in heartbeats, in the gradual easing of tension, in the slow recognition that safety might actually be possible. Samuel found himself studying her hands. They were artists' hands, long fingers, calloused in specific places that spoke of repetitive motion, of skill developed through practice. Despite the recent cuts from glass, he could see older scars, faint lines that suggested a history of working, with tools or materials that demanded precision. "Those look like hands that create things," he said quietly. "Beautiful things, I imagine." For the first time, her stillness wavered. Her fingers twitched almost imperceptibly, and though she didn't look up, Samuel sensed he had touched something, real beneath the protective shell she had constructed around herself. Dr. Manning appeared at the foot of the bed, chart in hand. "Social Services wants to place her in the county facility until they can determine her identity and situation. But given her condition..." She left the sentence unfinished, but Samuel understood. The county facility was overcrowded, understaffed, and ill-equipped to handle someone with complex trauma needs. "How soon do they need an answer?" Samuel asked. "End of shift. 6 hours, maybe less." Samuel looked back at the woman, noting the way she had begun to retreat further into herself at the mention of placement somewhere else. Her breathing had quickened slightly, her shoulders drawing up in a protective posture that spoke of two. Many times when decisions had been made about her life without her input. "What if I could arrange alternative placement?" Samuel asked. "Somewhere she could receive appropriate care while we work on communication." Dr. Manning raised an eyebrow. Samuel Hayes was known for his dedication to his patients, but this level of immediate investment was unusual even for him. "What did you have in mind?" Willowbrook Recovery Center has a specialized program for trauma-related communication disorders. Dr. Elizabeth Chen runs it. She's a colleague from my residency. They have the resources and expertise to provide both medical care and therapeutic support. "And the funding?" Samuel paused. Willowbrook was private, expensive, and insurance approval could take weeks. But something about this woman's situation demanded action rather than bureaucratic patience. "I'll handle the arrangements." The woman's head moved almost imperceptibly, not quite looking up, but shifting as if she were listening more intently. Samuel wondered what she made of these strangers discussing her future, whether she felt grateful or terrified, or simply resigned to having no control over what happened next. "I need to make some calls," Dr. Manning said. "But Samuel, You're taking on significant responsibility here. We don't know anything about her background, her family situation, or what kind of trauma we're dealing with. I understand the risks, Samuel replied. But look at her, really look at her. This isn't someone who needs to be processed through the system. This is someone who needs to be seen as a person first. After Dr. Manning left to make arrangements, Samuel remained beside the bed. The woman hadn't moved, but her breathing had settled into something more natural, less guarded. The immediate crisis of placement seemed to be resolving, but Samuel knew that was the easy part. The real work, helping her find her way back to her own voice, would require patience, skill, and a kind of faith in human resilience that sometimes felt like believing in miracles. "I don't know what brought you here," he said softly, "or what you've been through, but I want you to know that whatever happens next, you won't be alone in it. There are people who understand that healing doesn't follow a schedule, that trust can't be rushed, and that sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is simply survive until tomorrow." The afternoon light filtering through the emergency room. Windows had shifted by the time Dr. Chen arrived. Samuel had worked with Elizabeth during their residency at Johns Hopkins, where her innovative approaches to trauma therapy had earned respect from even the most traditional practitioners. She was brilliant, compassionate, and possessed an almost intuitive understanding of how trauma affected the brain's capacity for communication. "Samuel," she said, embracing him briefly before turning her attention to the patient. "Tell me what we know." Samuel ran through the limited information they had gathered, the discovery at the church, the lack of identification, the complete absence of verbal communication. Elizabeth listened intently, her trained eye taking in details that others might miss. "May I?" she asked, approaching the bedside with the same careful respect Samuel had shown. The woman's posture remained unchanged, but Elizabeth seemed to read something in her stillness that spoke to her professional experience. "I'm Dr. Chen," she said gently. "I work with people who have experienced difficult things, people who need time and space to find their own way back to communicating with the world. Dr. Hayes asked me to come because he believes I might be able to help you feel safer while you heal." Elizabeth spent several minutes simply observing, noting the woman's breathing patterns, the way she held her body, the subtle signs that indicated levels of stress and awareness. When she spoke again, her voice carried the authority of someone who had guided many people through the complex journey of trauma recovery. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "I run a place called Willowbrook," she continued. "It's quiet there, surrounded by gardens and trees. People come to stay with us when they need time to remember who they are underneath whatever has happened to them. You would have your own room, your own space, and no one would ask you to talk or perform, or be anything other than exactly who you are at this moment." For the first time since Samuel had arrived, the woman's head lifted slightly. Not enough to make eye contact, but enough to suggest she was weighing the words she was hearing against whatever internal calculations kept her safe. Elizabeth caught Samuel's eye and nodded toward the hallway. They stepped outside the curtained area, leaving the woman with the privacy to process what she had heard. "Selective mutism, secondary to trauma," Elizabeth said quietly. "Probably complex PTSD. The way she holds herself suggests long-term abuse, impossibly domestic violence. The cuts on her hands might not be accidental, could be defensive wounds." Samuel felt something cold settle in his stomach. He had suspected trauma, but hearing Elizabeth's professional assessment made the woman's situation feel both more urgent and more fragile. Treatment timeline? Months, possibly years. This level of withdrawal doesn't happen overnight, and recovery won't either. She'll need medical care, psychological support, and most importantly, a sense of control over her environment and choices. The fact that she's listening at all is actually encouraging. Many trauma survivors completely shut down. And you think Willowbrook is the right placement? Elizabeth was quiet for a moment, considering. Samuel, I've been doing this work for 8 years. I've seen people recover from things that should have broken them permanently. And I've seen others who never quite find their way back, but there's something about her. She paused, searching for the right words. She's not broken, hurt, yes, scared, absolutely. But there's strength there, a core that survived whatever she's been through. With the right support, the right environment, I think she could not only recover but thrive. They returned to the bedside, where the woman remained in her careful stillness, but Samuel noticed changes, subtle shifts in her posture that suggested she was no longer quite as tightly wound, as prepared for flight or defense. "The paperwork is being processed," Elizabeth said gently. "If you're willing, we'd like to offer you a place at Willowbrook. It's entirely your choice. You don't have to decide right now, and you can change your mind at any time. But if you'd like to come with us, Dr. Hayes and I will make sure you get there safely." The silence that followed felt different from the earlier silences. This one held weight, held consideration. Samuel found himself holding his breath, realizing how much he wanted her to say yes, how invested he had become in her recovery in just a few short hours. Finally, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. It was the smallest gesture, barely more than a slight lowering and raising of her chin. But in that moment, Samuel felt something shift, not just in her, but in himself. This woman, whose name they didn't even know, had somehow become important to him in a way that went beyond professional duty. The transfer to Willowbrook was arranged for the following morning. Samuel volunteered to accompany the transport, officially to ensure medical continuity, but privately because he couldn't bear the thought of her making the journey alone with strangers. As evening settled over the hospital, Samuel found himself stopping by her room one more time. She had been moved to a private room on the medical floor, away from the constant activity of the emergency department. A social worker had brought her a few basic items: a toothbrush, some simple clothing, a notebook and pen in case she wanted to write. The notebook lay unopened on the bedside table. "Tomorrow will be a new beginning," Samuel said softly, settling into the chair that had become familiar. "Willowbrook is a good place, with good people who understand that healing happens on its own timeline." She was looking out the window at the parking lot below, where the evening shift was changing and people were heading home to their families, their normal lives, their taken-for-granted ability to speak their thoughts and feelings aloud. "I know, you can't or won't talk right now," Samuel continued, "but I want you to know that when you're ready, whether that's tomorrow or next month or next year, there will be people ready to listen. Not just to words, but to whatever way you choose to communicate. Your voice matters, even when it's silent." As he stood to leave, Samuel noticed her reflection in the window glass. For just a moment, their eyes met in the reflection, and he saw something there that he hadn't seen before. Not hope exactly, but perhaps the faintest possibility that hope might someday be possible again. The night settled over the hospital like a blanket, bringing with it the different rhythms of evening shift. Fewer visitors, quieter hallways, the particular stillness that came when healing work continued in the darkness. Samuel completed his rounds, updated patient charts, and prepared for the next day's responsibilities. But as he finally headed home to his apartment across town, he found his thoughts returning again and again to the woman with the artist's hands and silent voice. Tomorrow would begin a new chapter in her story, and somehow he knew it would be a new chapter in his as well. The morning sun painted Willowbrook Recovery Center in shades of gold and amber, transforming the Victorian mansion into something that looked more like a sanctuary than a medical facility. The building sat nestled among 30 acres of carefully tended grounds, where winding paths led through gardens designed to soothe rather than impress. Ancient oak trees provided natural canopies, and the sound of a small creek running along. The eastern boundary created a constant, gentle background melody. Samuel had driven ahead of the medical transport, wanting to ensure everything was prepared for their arrival. He stood on the wraparound porch, breathing in air that smelled of pine needles and the last of autumn's roses. This place had always affected him deeply. There was something about Willowbrook that seemed to understand that healing required beauty, that the environment itself could be medicine. Dr. Chen emerged from the main entrance, her arms full of folders and wearing the comfortable confidence of someone who had found her true calling. "She'll be in the East Wing," she said, joining Samuel on the porch. "Room 12, it has the best view of the gardens and gets morning light without being too bright. I've arranged for Maria Santos to be her primary care coordinator." "Maria's excellent," Samuel agreed. He had worked with Maria during previous consultations at Willowbrook and knew her to be both professionally skilled and naturally intuitive. "About patient needs, what's the initial care plan?" "Gentle integration, no scheduled therapies for the first week, just medical monitoring and letting her acclimate. Maria will check on her regularly, but won't push for interaction. Meals can be taken in her room if she prefers. The goal is to let her nervous system settle before we even think about therapeutic intervention." The transport van wound up the tree-lined driveway, its medical equipment compartment a stark reminder of the clinical world they were leaving behind. Samuel watched through the vehicle's windows as their patient. He realized he had begun thinking of her as their patient, got her first glimpse of where she would be staying. Her face appeared briefly at the window, and Samuel caught a flicker of something that might have been surprise. Willowbrook looked nothing like the institutional facilities most people expected when they heard terms like recovery center or treatment facility. The Victorian architecture, the gardens, the sense of established peace, it all suggested a place where time moved more slowly, where healing could unfold naturally. The medical transport team efficiently handled the transfer, but Samuel noticed how the woman's posture changed as she stepped out of the vehicle. The rigid defensive stance she had maintained at the hospital softened slightly as she took in her surroundings. Her head turned slowly, taking in the gardens, the mature trees, the inviting porch with its rocking chairs and hanging baskets of late-blooming flowers. "Welcome to Willowbrook," Dr. Chen said warmly, approaching at a pace that felt unhurried. "I'm glad you decided to come with us." Maria Santos appeared from inside the building, her presence immediately calming. She was in her early 50s, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical bun, and eyes that seemed to see straight through to a person's heart. She had worked in trauma recovery for over 2 decades and possessed an almost supernatural ability to make people feel safe. "Hello," Maria said simply, her voice carrying the slight accent of her Puerto Rican heritage. "I'm Maria, and I'll be helping you get settled here. We're going to take things very slowly, at whatever pace feels right for you." The woman stood perfectly still, her bandaged hands visible beneath the sleeves of the donated sweater she wore. But Samuel noticed she was actively observing now, her eyes moving from person to person, taking in details of her new environment with the careful attention of someone assessing safety and threat levels. "Would you like to see your room?" Maria asked. "It's upstairs, nice and quiet, with a view of the gardens. You can rest there as long as you need to." The slightest nod, barely perceptible, but Maria caught it immediately. She had learned to read the smallest communications from patients who had temporarily lost access to their voices. They moved through Willowbrook's main floor, past the common areas that had been designed to feel more like a comfortable home than a medical facility. The living room featured overstuffed sofas arranged around a stone fireplace, bookshelves, filled with novels and poetry collections, and windows that looked out onto the peaceful grounds. The dining room held only a few small tables, allowing for intimate meals rather than institutional gatherings. Samuel followed the small group up the wide staircase, noting how the woman's fingers trailed lightly along the polished wooden banister. The gesture seemed unconscious, a tactile way of connecting with her new environment that suggested someone who experienced the world through multiple senses. Room 12 was perfect for someone who needed both beauty and security. The space was large enough to feel spacious but not overwhelming, with cream-colored walls and hardwood floors softened by a hand-woven rug in muted blues and greens. The bed was positioned to take advantage of the garden view, and a comfortable reading chair sat near the window. Most importantly, the door had a lock that worked from the inside, giving the occupant complete control over access. "This dresser has some basic clothing in different sizes," Maria explained, opening the top drawer to reveal neatly folded shirts, sweaters, and pants. "Nothing fancy, just comfortable things. There's a private bathroom through that door, and these windows open if you like fresh air." The woman moved slowly around the room, her fingers touching surfaces lightly. The windowsill, the back of the key, chair, the soft fabric of the bedspread. Samuel recognized the behavior from other trauma survivors. She was mapping the space, creating a mental inventory of exits, hiding places, and potential sources of comfort or threat. "Meals are served downstairs in the dining room," Maria continued, "but if you prefer to eat up here, that's completely fine. Just leave your door open a little, and I'll know you'd like a tray brought up. No questions asked, no explanations needed." Dr. Chen had remained near the doorway, giving the woman space to explore. "Dr. Hayes will be visiting regularly," she added. "He's consulting on your medical care, and he'll check in whenever he's here. But there's no pressure to see anyone you don't want to see, when you don't want to see them." Samuel stepped forward slightly. "I usually come by on Tuesday and Friday afternoons," he said gently. "Sometimes I just sit in the garden and read. You're welcome to join me or not, whatever feels right." For the first time since leaving the hospital, the woman's eyes met his directly. The contact lasted only a second, but in that brief moment, Samuel saw intelligence, wariness, and something that might have been gratitude. "We'll leave you to rest now," Maria said. "I'll check on you in a couple of hours, just to make sure you have everything you need. The call button is right here by the bed, if you need anything sooner." As they prepared to leave, the woman moved to the window and stood looking out at the gardens below. The view encompassed flower beds that had been designed to bloom in succession throughout the seasons, ensuring that there was always something beautiful to see. Even in late October, chrysanthemums provided splashes of gold and burgundy, while ornamental grasses swayed gently in the breeze. Samuel found himself reluctant to leave, though he couldn't quite articulate why. Perhaps it was the way she stood at the window, so still yet so present, like someone who had been running for a long time and was finally allowing herself to stop. Or perhaps it was simply that he had become invested in her recovery in a way that went beyond professional obligation. "She'll be safe here," Dr. Chen said quietly as they walked back down the hallway. "Maria has a gift for reading people, for knowing what they need even when they can't express it themselves." "What's the typical timeline for someone with her presentation?" Samuel asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer would be frustratingly imprecise. "It varies enormously. I've seen people begin communicating again within weeks, and I've seen others take years to feel safe enough to speak. The trauma appears to be severe, and selective mutism of this duration suggests the brain has found non-verbal communication to be necessary for survival." They had reached the main floor, where afternoon light streamed through tall windows and created patterns on the polished wooden floors. Other residents moved quietly through the common areas, some reading, others working on art projects. You sitting in comfortable silence. Willowbrook attracted people dealing with various forms of trauma and communication disorders, creating a community of individuals who understood that healing happened in many different ways. The encouraging sign, Dr. Chen continued, is that she's alert and responsive. She's processing information, making decisions, engaging with her environment. The pathways for communication are intact. They're just temporarily inaccessible due to trauma protection mechanisms. Samuel nodded, but his mind was already working through the complexities of her case. Selective mutism in adults was relatively rare and almost always indicated severe psychological trauma. The fact that she had no identification, no apparent family or friends searching for her, suggested either deliberate disappearance or circumstances so dire that normal support systems had been destroyed. "I'd like to do some research," he said. "Check missing persons reports. See if any hospitals or police departments have records that might match her description. Someone, somewhere, might be looking for her." "Carefully," Dr. Chen cautioned. "If she's running from something or someone, premature contact with the wrong people could be catastrophic for her recovery." That afternoon, Samuel returned to his office at the hospital and began the methodical process of searching databases and making calls to colleagues in neighboring states. Missing persons reports yielded several possibilities, but none quite matched their patient's description or circumstances. He contacted domestic violence shelters, thinking she might have fled an abusive situation, but again found no immediate connections. What struck him as he reviewed case files and reports was how many people simply disappeared from the system. Individuals who fell through the cracks of social services, law enforcement and medical care. Some by choice, seeking escape from impossible situations, others through circumstances beyond their control. Their patient could be any one of hundreds of women whose stories had been interrupted by trauma. His phone rang as the afternoon wore. On Dr. Chen's voice carried a note of cautious optimism. She ate lunch in her room and spent most of the afternoon by the window. Maria reports that she's been watching the gardeners work in the flower beds below. Small signs, but engagement with the environment is always positive. Any attempts at communication? None yet, but Maria thinks she might have been humming very quietly while she watched the garden work. It could be significant. Vocalization of any kind suggests the possibility of eventual speech recovery. Samuel felt an unexpected surge of hope at this news. Humming, even unconscious humming, indicated that her vocal cords were functioning, and that some part of her brain was still connected to the impulse to create sound. It was a small sign. But in cases like this, small signs could be profoundly meaningful. "I'll be on Tuesday as scheduled," he said. "Maybe I'll spend some time." In that flower bed she was watching, sometimes indirect presence is more therapeutic than direct interaction. That evening, Samuel found himself thinking about the woman as he prepared dinner in his quiet apartment. He realized he had been assigning her a temporary name in his thoughts. Clara, after the nurse Clara Barton, who had spent her life caring for people who couldn't care for themselves. The name seemed to fit her quiet strength, her capacity to endure. But names were important, and eventually she would need to reclaim her own or choose a new one. Identity was one of the first things trauma could strip away, and one of the last. Things to return during recovery. Samuel had seen patients struggle for months to remember not just their names, but who they had been before the events that had stolen their voices. Tuesday arrived with the crisp clarity that October days in the mountains often brought. Samuel had rearranged his hospital schedule to allow for longer visits to Willowbrook, officially justified as necessary consultation time, but privately motivated by his growing investment in Clara's recovery. He arrived at the center carrying a small bag of tools and a handful of bulbs he had picked up at the local nursery. If she was interested in the garden work, perhaps seeing someone plant bulbs that would bloom in spring might spark something: hope, curiosity, or simply the pleasure of watching something beautiful take root. Maria met him at the entrance, her expression thoughtful. She's been more active the last couple of days. Yesterday she spent time in the common room, just sitting and observing. She seems particularly drawn to Mrs. Peterson, one of our long-term residents who does watercolor painting. Any vocal sounds? Possibly. I thought I heard her crying very softly yesterday evening, but when I checked on her, she appeared to be asleep. Crying would actually be therapeutic. It's a form of emotional release that many trauma survivors have difficulty accessing. Samuel made his way to the garden area visible from room 12. The flower bed directly below her window needed preparation for winter, and planting spring bulbs would give him a legitimate reason to spend time there while allowing her to observe from a safe distance. He began working quietly, removing spent annuals and preparing the soil for tulip and daffodil bulbs. The work was meditative, requiring attention but not concentration, allowing his mind to wander while his hands stayed busy. Gardening had always been therapeutic for him, a way of connecting to cycles of growth and renewal that put human struggles into perspective. After about an hour, he became aware of being watched. A glance upward confirmed that Clara stood at her window, partially hidden behind the curtain, but clearly observing his work. He continued planting, occasionally narrating his actions in a voice just loud enough to carry if she was listening. "These tulips should come up red in early spring," he said, settling a bulb into its prepared hole. "Daffodils are more reliable, though. They'll multiply each year, creating bigger displays over time." He worked for another hour, aware of her continued presence at the window. When he finally gathered his tools and prepared to leave, he looked up toward her room and raised his hand in a small wave. She stepped back from the window quickly, but he thought he had seen the slightest movement of her hand in return. Maria was waiting for him near the main entrance, her face bright with news. "She came downstairs for dinner last night, didn't eat in the dining room, but she came down to the kitchen and helped Mrs. Chen prepare vegetables. No talking, but she seemed to know her way around food preparation." "Muscle memory," Samuel said thoughtfully. "She might have worked in food service or simply cooked regularly for herself or others. It's another piece of the puzzle." "There's more," Maria continued. "Mrs. Peterson left some watercolor supplies outside her door yesterday. Nothing forced, just made them available. This morning, the supplies were gone, and I could swear I could smell paint from her room, though she hasn't asked for any assistance or shown us anything she might have created." Samuel felt that familiar surge of hope. Art therapy was often breakthrough for trauma survivors, providing a way to express thoughts and feelings that couldn't yet be spoken aloud. If Clara was painting, she was not just surviving, but beginning to process her experiences in a constructive way. "I'd like to leave some things for her," Samuel said. "Nothing medical or therapeutic, just things that might be useful or interesting. Books about gardening, maybe some music, materials for creative projects. That sounds perfect." She responds well to choices, to having things available without pressure to use them. It suggests she's beginning to trust that this environment is genuinely safe. As Samuel drove back to the hospital that afternoon, he found himself thinking about the complexity of trust after trauma. For someone like Clara, every small gesture of safety had to be tested, evaluated, and gradually accepted. The fact that she was beginning to engage with activities, even privately, suggested that Willowbrook's therapeutic environment was working exactly as intended. But he also knew that recovery was rarely linear. There would likely be setbacks, difficult days, moments when fear overwhelmed progress. The key was to maintain consistent, patient support while allowing her to set the pace of her own healing. That evening, Samuel stopped at a bookstore and selected several volumes he thought might appeal to someone with artistic sensibilities. Books about garden design, collections of nature photography, and a beautifully illustrated guide to watercolor techniques. He added a small radio with soft classical music stations and a journal with blank pages that could be used for writing, drawing, or simply having a private space for thoughts. He would leave these items with Maria, who would present them as available resources rather than prescribed therapies. The distinction was crucial. Clara needed to feel that she had choice and control over her environment and activities. Healing required agency, the gradual reclamation of personal power that trauma had temporarily stolen away. As October gave way to November, Samuel established a routine of visiting Willowbrook twice weekly, always spending time in the gardens where Clara could observe from her window if she chose. Sometimes he worked with plants, sometimes he simply sat reading in view of her room. The consistency seemed important. She was learning that he could be trusted to appear when expected and to respect her need for distance. Dr. Chen reported continued progress. Clara had begun eating meals in the common areas, though she still chose tables that offered clear views of exits and positioned herself where she could observe others without being directly approached. She spent hours with the watercolor supplies and had begun what appeared to be a series of paintings depicting the garden views from her window. Most significantly, Maria reported hearing what sounded like whispered singing late one evening. When she had approached Clara's room to check, the sound had stopped. But the fact that vocalization was occurring at all suggested that her brain was beginning to reconnect with the pathways necessary for speech. Samuel knew they were still in the early stages of what would likely be a long recovery process, but each small sign of progress felt like a victory, evidence that the human capacity for healing was stronger than even the deepest trauma. Clara was finding her way back to herself, one careful step at a time, surrounded by people who understood that healing required patience, respect, and unwavering belief in the possibility of recovery. November brought the first frost to Willowbrook's gardens, transforming the landscape into something crystalline and otherworldly. Clara stood at her window each morning, watching ice crystals melt into dewdrops on the rose hips and ornamental grasses. The changing seasons seemed to mirror something shifting within her, a gradual thawing of the protective barriers she had built around herself. Samuel had established his rhythm of Tuesday and Friday visits, sometimes working in the gardens, other times simply reading beneath the old maple tree, where fallen leaves created a natural carpet of gold and crimson. He never looked directly up at her window, but Clara had begun to sense his awareness of her presence, the way he positioned himself where she could see him clearly, the way he moved with deliberate calm that felt designed to soothe rather than startle. Today was different. Instead of his usual solitary activities, Samuel had arrived with Dr. Chen and another woman Clara didn't recognize. They were setting up what appeared to be an outdoor easel near the flower bed, where Samuel had planted the spring bulbs. The unknown woman began arranging art supplies on a small folding table, her movements efficient and purposeful. Clara pressed closer to the window, curious despite her instinctive wariness of changes to established routines. The woman appeared to be in her 60s, with silver hair braided down her back and clothing that suggested someone comfortable with getting paint on her hands. She worked with the confidence of long practice, testing brushes and squeezing colors onto a palette, with the focus of someone preparing for serious creative work. A soft knock on her door interrupted Clara's observation. Maria's voice came through the wood, gentle and respectful as always. "Clara, there's someone downstairs I think you might like to meet, an artist named Helen Morrison. She's teaching a watercolor class in the garden this afternoon, and Dr. Hayes thought you might be interested." Clara stepped back from the window, her heart rate increasing slightly. The invitation felt different from the passive choices she had been offered before. This was more direct, more social, requiring her to make a decision about interacting with another person rather than simply observing from a distance. "No pressure at all," Maria continued. "You can watch from your window, come down and observe without participating, or join in if you feel like it. Helen will be here for a couple of hours, so you have time to decide." The door remained closed between them, but Clara appreciated Maria's understanding that she needed to process invitations slowly, that decisions about social interaction required careful consideration rather than immediate response. From her window, Clara watched Dr. Chen and Samuel retreat to a respectful distance while Helen continued her preparations. The artist began painting what appeared to be the view Clara herself had been capturing in her private watercolors: the garden beds, the play of light through the bare branches, the way the late autumn sun cast long shadows across the frost-touched grass. Something about watching another artist's work called to Clara in ways that simple observation of gardening or reading hadn't. Helen's brushstrokes were confident but sensitive, building layers of color that captured not just the visual appearance of the landscape, but something of its emotional essence. Clara found herself leaning forward, trying to see the technique more clearly, noting how Helen mixed colors on the palette and applied them to paper, without fully realizing she had made the decision. Clara found herself moving away from the window. She paused at her dresser, considering her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to whoever she had been before arriving at St. Catherine's Church that rainy night. Her face was fuller now, no longer gaunt with hunger and exhaustion. Her hair, clean and growing longer, framed features that were beginning to look more like those of a person rather than a trauma survivor. She selected a warm sweater from the drawer, one of the soft cardigans that had appeared in her room during her first week at Willowbrook. The clothing here was clearly chosen with care, prioritizing comfort and dignity over institutional efficiency. Clara had gradually claimed certain pieces as her own, developing preferences and attachments that felt like small acts of reclaiming identity. The journey downstairs felt monumental despite its brevity. Clara moved slowly through the familiar hallways, noting how the afternoon light fell differently at this time of day, how the common areas looked from the perspective of someone choosing to enter them rather than someone simply passing through. Other residents looked up as she passed, offering gentle nods or smiles that acknowledged her presence without demanding a response. The French doors leading to the garden stood open, letting in the crisp November air along with the scent of dying leaves and wood smoke from someone's distant fireplace. Clara paused in the doorway, observing the scene she had been watching from above. Helen worked with complete absorption, her brush moving across the paper in confident strokes that seemed to capture the very essence of the autumn afternoon. Small collection of completed paintings lay spread on a blanket beside her easel, each one exploring different aspects of the garden's late-season beauty. "Would you like to see?" Helen asked without turning around, somehow sensing Clara's presence despite her silent approach. Her voice carried the warmth of someone accustomed to working with shy or uncertain students. Clara hesitated, then took a step closer. The paintings were extraordinary, not photorealistic, but emotionally accurate in a way that spoke to Clara's own artistic sensibilities. Helen had captured the melancholy beauty of November, the way dying gardens held their own particular grace. "I teach watercolor to people who are finding their way back to expressing themselves," Helen said conversationally, still focused on her work. "Sometimes words aren't available, but color and light and the movement of a brush on paper can say things that need saying." She gestured toward a second easel that Clara hadn't noticed before, set up with fresh paper and a complete set of watercolor supplies. "I brought extra materials just in case anyone wanted to paint alongside me." No instruction unless you want it, no conversation required. Sometimes the best teaching happens when people simply paint together in peaceful silence. Clara stared at the offered easel, feeling something stir inside her that she hadn't experienced since arriving at Willowbrook. It wasn't quite excitement, she wasn't ready for emotions that intense, but it was definitely interest, a pulling toward creative expression that felt both familiar and revelatory. Without quite deciding to do so, Clara found herself moving toward the second easel. Helen smiled but didn't comment, simply continuing her own work while making space for Clara to set up beside her. The supplies were professional quality, better than anything Clara had worked with in her room, with brushes that felt perfectly balanced and colors that seemed to glow even in their dried state on the palette. Clara picked up a brush, testing its weight and flexibility. The motion felt natural, as if her hand remembered skills her conscious mind had temporarily misplaced. She wet the brush in the jar of clean water, then touched it to the blue on Helen's palette, watching the color bloom across the bristles. Her first stroke on the paper was tentative, experimental. Blue sky, or perhaps water. She wasn't yet sure what she was painting, only that she needed to make marks, to translate something internal into visible form. The second stroke was more confident, and the third began to suggest the outline of something recognizable. Helen worked quietly beside her, occasionally mixing new colors or stepping back to evaluate her progress, but never commenting on Clara's emerging painting or offering unsolicited advice. The companionable silence felt different from the protective silence Clara had maintained for weeks. This was creative silence, the kind that allowed thoughts and feelings to flow through brush and pigment rather than words. Time moved differently when painting. Clara lost track of how long she had been working, aware only of the gradual emergence of an image she hadn't consciously planned. What appeared on her paper was the view from her window at Willowbrook. But transformed, the garden beds were filled with the spring flowers Samuel had planted, blooming in impossible abundance, while figures moved through the landscape like memories or dreams. "That's beautiful work," Helen said softly, when Clara finally stepped back from her easel. "You have a wonderful sense of color and composition. Have you painted much before?" Clara looked at the older woman, feeling the familiar tightness in her throat that came whenever someone asked a direct question. But something about Helen's manner, her genuine interest combined with patient acceptance, made the silence feel less like a barrier and more like a choice. Helen seemed to understand that no answer was forthcoming, but also that Clara's lack of response wasn't rejection. "I taught art therapy for 30 years before I retired," she said conversationally. "Worked with all kinds of people who needed to find new ways to communicate. The thing I learned is that healing often happens in the spaces between words, in the places where color meets paper and something true gets expressed." Clara found herself nodding slightly, the first clear gesture of agreement she had made in response to another person since arriving at Willowbrook. Helen caught the movement and smiled, her eyes crinkling with the kind of warmth that came from decades of helping people rediscover their voices. "I come here every Tuesday afternoon," Helen continued, beginning to clean her brushes with practiced efficiency. "Sometimes I paint alone, sometimes others join me. You're welcome anytime, to paint, to watch, or just to sit quietly. No expectations, no requirements." As Helen packed up her supplies, Clara remained standing beside her easel, looking at what she had created. The painting wasn't technically perfect. Her technique showed signs of being out of practice, but it expressed something she hadn't known she needed to express. Hope, perhaps, or simply the possibility that beauty could exist in the same world. That had taken her voice away. Samuel appeared from wherever he had been giving them privacy, approaching slowly and stopping at a respectful distance. "May I see?" he asked, directing the question to Clara rather than commenting without permission. Clara looked at him, then at her painting, then back at him. After a moment that felt like a small eternity, she stepped slightly aside, offering him a clearer view of her work. Samuel studied the painting with the attention it deserved, his expression thoughtful and appreciative. "It's extraordinary," he said finally. "The way you've captured not just how the garden looks, but how it feels. There's so much life in it, so much possibility." Something in his tone, the genuine respect he showed for her artistic expression, made Clara feel seen in a way that went beyond the careful medical observation she had grown accustomed to. This was recognition of her as a person with talents and perspectives worth valuing, not just as a patient requiring care. "Helen has offered to continue working with you," Samuel continued, "if you're interested. But also, I was wondering if you might like to see more of the grounds here at Willowbrook. There are gardens on the other side of the building, and a greenhouse where they grow plants year-round. Sometimes a change of scenery can be inspiring for artists." Clara considered this invitation. The idea of exploring beyond the familiar view from her window felt both exciting and terrifying. But the afternoon's success with painting had awakened something in her, a curiosity about what other forms of beauty existed in this place that had become her temporary sanctuary. She nodded, a more definitive gesture than her earlier tentative agreement with Helen. "Wonderful," Samuel said, his smile reflecting genuine pleasure at her decision. "We could walk over there now if you'd like. No pressure to stay long, just a chance to see something new." The walk to the Eastern Gardens felt like a journey to another world. Clara had spent weeks viewing Willowbrook from the limited perspective of her room and the common areas she had gradually begun to inhabit. Seeing the full scope of the property, the additional flower beds, the vegetable garden, where residents could work if they chose, the small orchard of fruit trees, expanded her understanding of where she was staying. Clara looked at him, then back at the plants. Slowly, deliberately, she reached out again and cupped one of the small leaves between her fingers. The texture was exactly what she had expected, soft, slightly fuzzy, alive with the particular vitality of growing things. Something about that simple contact with life, with growth, with the promise of future fruit, made Clara's eyes fill with tears. They were the first tears she had allowed herself since arriving at Willowbrook, and they came not from sadness, but from a recognition that she was still capable of experiencing beauty, still connected to the world of living things. Samuel pretended not to notice her tears, understanding instinctively that this moment required privacy even within companionship. He moved to examine some nearby herb plants, giving Clara space to experience whatever emotions the greenhouse had awakened in her. When she had composed herself, Clara joined him near a collection of mint plants, their leaves releasing fresh fragrance when disturbed. Samuel was gently crushing a spring between his fingers, releasing the sharp, clean scent into the warm air. "Peppermint," he said, offering her the crushed leaves to smell. "One of the most resilient plants in the world. It can survive almost anything, drought, frost, being cut back to the ground, and it always comes back stronger." Clara accepted the mint leaves, breathing in their sharp sweetness. The metaphor wasn't lost on her: resilience, survival, the possibility of growing back stronger after being cut down. Whether Samuel intended the parallel, or it was simply her own mind making connections, the message felt like exactly what she needed to hear. As they prepared to leave the greenhouse, Clara turned back for one last look at the green abundance surrounding them. This space felt like proof that growth was possible even in the depths of winter, that life could thrive even in protected, controlled environments. She was beginning to understand that Willowbrook itself was like a greenhouse for healing, a place where people could recover and regrow in safety before facing the larger world again. The walk back to the main building took them past other areas. Clara hadn't seen before. A meditation garden with carefully placed benches, a small labyrinth made of stones that residents could walk for contemplation, and a workshop building where the sounds of woodworking and other crafts could be heard, even with the doors closed. "There are many ways to heal here," Samuel observed as they paused outside the workshop. "Art, gardening, music, meditation, crafts. The idea is to find what speaks to each person individually, what helps them reconnect with parts of themselves that trauma may have made temporarily inaccessible." Clara nodded, understanding flowing between them without need for words. She was beginning to see Willowbrook not just as a place where she was safe, but as a place where she could actively participate in her own recovery. The painting session with Helen had awakened something in her, and the greenhouse visit had reminded her of her connection to life and growth. As they reached the main building, Clara paused at the entrance and turned to look back at Samuel. For the first time since her arrival, she attempted to speak. No sound emerged, but her lips moved in the shape of a word. "Thank you." Samuel caught the gesture, his expression reflecting both understanding and encouragement. "You're very welcome," he said softly. "And Clara, you don't need to thank me for anything. Healing is something you're doing for yourself. I'm just honored to witness it." The use of a name, Clara, stopped her short. She hadn't told anyone her name, hadn't confirmed that Clara was what she wanted to be called, but somehow, hearing it spoken with such respect and warmth made her feel more real, more present in her own life. As she climbed the stairs to her room that evening, Clara felt something she hadn't experienced in longer than she could remember. Not happiness exactly, but possibility. The sense that tomorrow might bring opportunities for growth, for expression, for small steps toward reclaiming the person she had been before trauma had stolen her voice. She spent the evening looking at the painting she had brought upstairs, seeing in it not just the flowers and garden paths she had depicted, but evidence of her own capacity for creation, for bringing beauty into the world despite everything she had endured. Outside her window, the gardens lay quiet under the early November stars, but Clara knew that beneath the surface bulbs were taking root, preparing for spring's eventual arrival. She was beginning to understand that healing, like gardening, was often invisible work that happened in darkness and silence before emerging into light. December arrived at Willowbrook with the kind of pristine snow that transformed the landscape into something from a fairy tale. Clara woke to find her window framed in white, the garden beds beneath buried under 6 inches of fresh powder that made everything appear new and unblemished. She had been at the recovery center for nearly 2 months now, and the changing seasons felt like markers of her own transformation. The Tuesday painting sessions with Helen had become the anchor point of Clara's week. What had started as tentative participation had evolved into genuine collaboration, with Clara contributing ideas through gesture and shared creative work when words remained elusive. Her paintings had grown more complex, more emotionally nuanced, each one revealing layers of experience and feeling that she couldn't yet speak aloud. This morning felt different, though Clara couldn't immediately identify why. Perhaps it was the way the snow had muffled all sound, creating a hushed cathedral of silence that felt protective rather than isolating. Or perhaps it was the letter that sat unopened on her dresser, the first piece of mail she had received since arriving at Willowbrook. Maria had delivered it the evening before, explaining that it had arrived through Dr. Chen's office rather than through normal postal channels. The return address simply read, Philadelphia County Social Services, and something about those words had sent a chill through Clara that had nothing to do with winter weather. She had stared at the envelope for hours without opening it, afraid of what information it might contain about her past, her identity, or the circumstances that had led to her desperate appearance at St. Catherine's Church. The safety she had built at Willowbrook felt fragile suddenly, threatened by the possibility that her carefully constructed healing space might be disrupted by demands from the outside world. A soft knock interrupted her contemplation. Samuel's voice came through the door, gentle but carrying a note of concern. "Clara, I know this is outside our usual schedule, but I wondered if we might talk about the letter you received. Dr. Chen thought it might be helpful to have support when you decide whether to open it." Clara looked from the envelope to the door, weighing her options. She had grown to trust Samuel completely during their weeks of garden visits and quiet conversations. But this felt different from their usual interactions. This was about her, asked her identity, things she wasn't sure she was ready to reclaim or confront. After several minutes of internal debate, she moved to the door and opened it. Samuel stood in the hallway holding 2 cups of tea, his expression patient and understanding. He had learned to read her moods and needs with the precision of someone who had made her well-being his personal responsibility. "I brought chamomile," he said, offering her one of the cups. "Sometimes difficult decisions are easier to make with warm hands and a calm nervous system." Clara accepted the tea gratefully, inhaling the soothing steam as she led him into her room. The space had evolved significantly since her arrival. Art supplies organized on a makeshift desk, several of her watercolor paintings hung on the walls, and books stacked beside her reading chair. It felt like a real living space now, rather than a temporary shelter. Samuel settled into the chair beside the window, while Clara perched on the edge of her bed, the unopened letter within reach, but not quite touching it. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching snow continue to fall outside, while the warmth of the tea and Samuel's steady presence helped calm Clara's anxiety. "Whatever that letter contains," Samuel said finally, "it doesn't change the progress you've made here. It doesn't diminish the strength you've shown or the healing that's already taken place. Information about your past might be helpful, but it's not required for your recovery to continue." Clara appreciated his words, but they didn't entirely quiet the fear that opening the letter might somehow pull her back into whatever circumstances had stolen her voice in the first place. She had built a life at Willowbrook, small and protected, but genuinely hers in ways that felt precious and new. Samuel seemed to sense her internal struggle. "Would it help if I opened it first? I could read it privately and give you just the essential information, or we could read it together. You have complete control over how much or how little you want to know." The offer felt like a lifeline. Clara had become adept at communicating through gesture and expression, and she nodded gratefully while pointing toward Samuel and then the letter. She wanted him to read it first, to filter whatever information it contained through his judgment and care for her well-being. Samuel picked up the envelope carefully, studying the return address and postmark before opening it with the letter opener Clara handed him from her desk. He unfolded the single sheet of paper inside, his expression neutral as he read. Clara watched his face intently, looking for any sign of alarm or distress that might warn her about the letter's contents. After reading through the entire document, Samuel folded it carefully and set it aside. His expression was thoughtful, but not troubled, which helped ease some of Clara's tension. "It's actually quite straightforward," he said gently. "Social Services received an inquiry about you from a missing persons report filed by someone named Margaret Henley in Philadelphia. She reported her daughter Emma missing 3 months ago, and the description matches your appearance. The letter is asking if you might be Emma Henley, and if so, whether you're safe and receiving appropriate care." Clara felt something shift inside her at hearing the name Emma. Not recognition exactly, but a kind of resonance, as if some part of her remembered being called by that name in contexts that felt warm and safe. Margaret Henley, though, that name stirred more complex emotions, a mixture of longing and fear that she couldn't quite pass. The letter doesn't require any immediate response, Samuel continued. It's simply gathering information to determine if you are Emma Henley, and if you are, to establish that you're in a safe situation. There's no pressure to make contact with this Margaret person, no requirement that you return to Philadelphia or resume whatever life you had before. Clara picked up her sketchpad and pencil, tools she had begun using to communicate more complex thoughts than gesture could convey. She wrote carefully, her handwriting still slightly shaky but legible. What if I am Emma? What if going back means going back to whatever made me run? Samuel read her question and nodded seriously. That's exactly the right concern to have. If you are Emma Henley, and if you left Philadelphia because of dangerous or harmful circumstances, then the priority is keeping you safe while we gather more information. No one can force you to return to a situation that threatened your well-being. He paused, choosing his words carefully. But Clara or Emma, there's also the possibility that someone is genuinely worried about you. Someone who cares about your welfare and has been searching for you out of love rather than control. The letter mentions that Margaret Henley has been working with victim advocacy groups, which suggests she might understand that you left for serious reasons. Clara wrote again, "How do we find out which it is without putting me in danger?" "Very carefully," Samuel replied. "Dr. Chen has experience with these situations. We can work with the social services investigator to gather more information about your background, about Margaret Henley, about the circumstances that might have led to your leaving Philadelphia. All of this can be done without revealing your location or requiring any contact on your part." The conversation was interrupted by another knock on the door. Dr. Chen's voice called softly, "Clara? Samuel? I have Helen Morrison with me, and we wondered if we might join you. Helen has some experience with situations like this that might be helpful." Clara looked to Samuel, who nodded encouragingly. She had come to trust both Dr. Chen and Helen completely, and their combined wisdom felt like additional protection against whatever uncertainties the letter had introduced. The four of them gathered in Clara's room, creating an impromptu support team around the question of her identity and past. Helen sat beside Clara on the bed, her artist's hands folded calmly in her lap, while Dr. Chen reviewed the letter with the clinical thoroughness that had made her so effective at helping trauma survivors navigate complex situations. "I've worked with several women who fled abusive situations and ended up in selective mutism," Helen said after reading the letter. "Sometimes the silence protects us, not just from having to explain what happened, but from having to face the reality of whether it's safe to return. The good news is that we don't have to make any decisions today, or this week, or even this month," Dr. Chen added. "What I'd like to suggest is a gradual information-gathering process. We can request background information about Margaret Henley, criminal records, employment history, living situation. We can also research Emma Henley's medical records, school records, anything that might help us understand what her life was like before she disappeared." Clara wrote on her pad, "What if the information is bad? What if I remember things I don't want to remember? Then we deal with those memories together," Dr. Chen replied firmly. "Recovery doesn't require you to face everything all at once. We can process information in small pieces at whatever pace feels manageable. And if we discover that returning to your previous life isn't safe or healthy, then we help you build a new life with full legal protection." Samuel leaned forward slightly. "There's something else to consider. If you are Emma Henley, and if Margaret is someone who genuinely cares about you, then she's been living with uncertainty and fear for 3 months. She doesn't know if you're alive, if you're hurt, if you need help, even if you're not ready. For contact, we might be able to send word that you're safe without revealing where you are. The suggestion resonated with Clara in unexpected ways. The idea that someone might be worried about her, might be losing sleep, wondering if she was dead or suffering, awakened feelings of responsibility and connection that had been dormant since her arrival at Willowbrook. If Margaret Henley was truly concerned rather than controlling, then her continued silence was causing unnecessary pain. Clara wrote, "Can you find out about her without her knowing you're looking?" "Yes," Dr. Chen said. "I have contacts in social services and victim advocacy who can research backgrounds discreetly. We can learn about Margaret Henley's situation, her relationship to Emma, and the circumstances surrounding the missing persons. Report without alerting anyone to your location." Helen reached over and gently touched Clara's hand. "Whatever we discover, you get to choose what happens next. If Margaret Henley is someone safe, you can decide whether and how to make contact. If she's not safe, we help you disappear permanently. If the situation is complicated, we take time to figure out the best path forward. You have complete control over your own story." The afternoon passed with careful planning and gentle reassurance. Dr. Chen outlined the investigation process. Helen shared stories of other women who had successfully navigated similar situations, and Samuel provided the steady emotional support that had become essential to Clara's sense of safety. By evening, Clara felt simultaneously anxious and relieved. The mystery of her identity would finally begin to unravel, but at her own pace, and with people she trusted guiding the process. Whatever she discovered about Emma Henley's past, she would face it as Clara, the person she had become at Willowbrook, strengthened by weeks of healing and supported by people who valued her well-being above all else. That night, she sat at her easel working on a new painting by lamplight. This one was different from her previous work. Not a landscape or garden scene, but a portrait of a woman standing at a crossroads. The figure's face was partially obscured, as if she were choosing which direction to take, but her posture suggested strength rather than uncertainty. As she painted, Clara found herself humming softly, a melody that seemed to emerge from somewhere deep in her memory. The sound of her own voice, even wordless, felt like a small miracle after months of silence. She was beginning to understand that reclaiming her voice would happen gradually, in layers, as she became ready to speak the truths that trauma had temporarily made unspeakable. The snow continued falling outside her window, blanketing Willowbrook in pristine quiet. But inside her room, surrounded by evidence of her own creativity and healing, Clara felt something stirring that might have been excitement. Tomorrow would bring the beginning of answers about who she had been before, but tonight she was content to be exactly who she was becoming, a woman finding her way back to her own voice, one gentle day at a time. The investigation into her past would unfold slowly, carefully, with her well-being as the guiding principle. Whatever Emma Henley's story revealed, Clara trusted that she now had the strength and support to face it. The silence that had once protected her was gradually becoming a choice rather than a necessity, and with that choice came the possibility of deciding not just who she had been, but who she wanted to become. As she prepared for bed, Clara looked at the painting she had been working on. The woman at the crossroads seemed more confident now, more certain of her own power to choose her direction. Tomorrow would bring new information, new decisions, new steps forward in the complex journey of healing. But tonight, Clara slept peacefully, surrounded by evidence of her own resilience and the unwavering support of people who believed in her recovery. Outside, the snow fell steadily, covering old footprints and creating fresh possibilities for tomorrow's paths. Inside Willowbrook, a woman who had once been lost was preparing to discover not just who she had been, but who she was meant to become. The silence that had once been her prison was becoming her sanctuary, a quiet space where healing could continue to unfold at exactly the pace her heart required. The investigation into Emma Henley's background began with the methodical precision that Dr. Chen brought to all her complex cases. Over the course of a week, information trickled in through her network of social workers, victim advocates, and law enforcement contacts. Each piece of data was carefully reviewed before being shared with Clara, ensuring that revelations about her past wouldn't overwhelm the progress she had made at Willowbrook. The first breakthrough came on a Thursday morning, when Dr. Chen knocked on Clara's door carrying a thick folder and wearing an expression that mixed relief with cautious optimism. Clara had been working in her sketchbook, drawing detailed studies of winter birds she observed from her window. Cardinals bright against the snow, chickadees fluffed against the cold, a red-tailed hawk that perched regularly in the old oak tree. "I have some information about Margaret Henley," Dr. Chen said, settling into the chair that had become reserved for these sensitive conversations. "Would you like to hear what we've learned?" Clara set down her pencil and nodded, though her heart rate increased noticeably. Each new piece of information felt like stepping closer to a cliff edge, necessary but frightening, with the potential for either solid ground or empty air beneath her feet. Margaret Henley is 53 years old, works as a high school art teacher in Philadelphia, and has no criminal record of any kind, Dr. Chen began. She lives alone in a small apartment, has been teaching for 28 years, and according to her colleagues, she's known for taking in students who need extra support. Clara felt something loosen in her chest at the mention of the art teacher. The detail felt familiar in a way that was comforting rather than threatening, like remembering the scent of a favorite meal without being able to recall the specific occasion when you first smelled it. More importantly, Dr. Chen continued, I spoke with the victim advocate who's been helping her navigate the missing persons process. Margaret has been very clear that she believes Emma left because of a dangerous situation, and she's been working with domestic violence organizations to ensure that if Emma is found, she won't be forced to return to anyone or anywhere unsafe. Dr. Chen opened the folder and withdrew a photograph. "This is Margaret Henley," she said, offering the image to Clara. The victim's advocate thought seeing her face might help trigger memories, but there's no pressure to recognize her if you don't. Clara accepted the photograph with trembling hands. The woman looking back at her from the image had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, graying brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and paint stains on her fingers that were visible, even in the photograph. She wore a paint-smeared apron over a simple sweater, and her smile suggested someone comfortable with herself and her place in the world. The moment Clara's eyes focused on Margaret's face, something shifted deep in her. Memory. Not a flood of recollection, but a warm recognition that felt like coming home after a long journey. She knew this face, loved this face, had trusted this face in ways that felt fundamental to who she was. Tears began flowing down Clara's cheeks, but they weren't tears of fear or distress. They were tears of recognition, of relief, of remembering that she had once been someone's daughter and that this someone had been searching for her with love rather than anger. "You recognize her," Dr. Chen observed gently. "Take your time processing. Whatever you're feeling, there's no rush to understand everything at once." Clara wiped her eyes and reached for her sketchbook, writing with slightly shaky handwriting. "She taught me to paint. She's my mother. I remember her hands showing me how to hold a brush." Dr. Chen smiled, the first genuinely happy expression Clara had seen from her in their weeks of working together. "That explains your natural artistic ability. It also explains why Margaret was so certain that Emma was in danger. Mothers know when their children are running from something rather than running to something." Clara wrote again. "Why can't I remember what I was running from? Why can I remember her, but not what happened to make me leave?" "Trauma memory is selective," Dr. Chen explained. Your brain has preserved the memories that feel safe. Your mother's love, artistic training, experiences that reinforced your sense of self-worth. The dangerous memories are locked away until you feel strong enough to process them safely. Clara stared at Margaret's photograph, tracing her mother's familiar features with her eyes. Gradually, fragments of memory began surfacing. Afternoons in Margaret's classroom after school, mixing colors on palettes while her mother prepared lessons. Weekends spent in art supply stores, choosing new brushes and paper. Quiet evenings, when they painted side by side at the kitchen table while classical music played softly in the background. But alongside these warm recollections came flashes of something darker, raised voices, slamming doors, a man's face contorted with anger. Clara's breathing became shallow as these threatening images tried to surface, and she quickly looked away from the photograph. Dr. Chen noticed the change immediately. "Easy," she said soothingly. "You don't have to remember everything today. The dangerous memories will surface when you're ready to handle them, not before." Clara wrote, "There was a man. He was angry. I was afraid of him." "That matches what Margaret told the victim advocate," Dr. Chen confirmed. "She mentioned that Emma had been in a relationship that became controlling and violent. Margaret tried to convince Emma to leave him, but she was worried about going to the police because he had threatened to hurt both Emma and Margaret if she reported him." The pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity. Clara remembered. Now, not the specific details yet, but the general shape of what had driven her from Philadelphia. A boyfriend who had seemed charming initially, but had gradually become possessive, jealous, violent. Months of walking on eggshells, of making excuses for bruises, of becoming smaller and quieter to avoid triggering his rage. Clara wrote, "He said he would kill us both if I left. I believed him." "You had good reason to believe him," Dr. Chen said firmly. "Domestic violence escalates, and the most dangerous time for victims is when they try to leave. You were protecting both yourself and your mother by disappearing." Clara looked at Margaret's photograph again, this time seeing beyond the paint stains and kind smile to the worry lines around her eyes. The tension in her shoulders that suggested months of sleepless nights and constant fear. Her mother had been living with the same terror that had driven Clara away, not knowing if her daughter was alive, not knowing if the man who had threatened them both had followed through on his promises of violence. "What's his name?" Clara wrote, though her hands shook as she formed the letters. Dr. Chen hesitated. "Are you sure you want to know? We can proceed with contacting your mother without you having to confront details about him." Clara nodded firmly. Whatever healing lay ahead required facing the truth about what she had survived, not continuing to hide from it. "Derek Martinez," Dr. Chen said. "He's been arrested twice since you disappeared. Once for assault, once for violating a restraining order against another woman. He's currently in county jail, awaiting trial." The name hit Clara like a physical blow, bringing with it a rush of memories she wasn't prepared for. Derek's hands around her throat, Derek screaming that she belonged to him, Derek destroying her. Paintings when he decided she was spending too much time on art instead of him. Derek following her to work, showing up at her mother's school, making it clear that there was nowhere she could go that he wouldn't find her. Clara doubled over, gasping for breath as the suppressed memories crashed through her consciousness. Dr. Chen was beside her instantly, one hand on her back, voice calm and grounding. "Breathe with me," Dr. Chen said. "In for 4 counts, hold for 4, out for 4. You're safe now. He's in jail. He can't hurt you or your mother." It took several minutes for Clara's breathing to return to normal, for the panic attack triggered by Derek's name to subside. When Mao Xun, she finally straightened up. She felt exhausted, but somehow clearer, as if remembering the worst of what had happened had paradoxically freed her from its power over her. "He's really in jail," she wrote. "Yes, and according to my contact in Philadelphia." PD, he's likely to be sentenced to significant prison time. The other woman he assaulted has pressed charges, and there's a pattern of escalating violence that prosecutors take very seriously. Clara felt something she hadn't experienced in months, a sense of actual safety that went beyond the protected environment of Willowbrook. If Derek was in jail, if he was facing real consequences for his violence, then the immediate threat that had driven her into hiding was neutralized. "Can I contact my mother?" she wrote, the words coming out in a rush of desperate longing. "We can arrange that," Dr. Chen said gently. "But let's think about how you want to approach it. You haven't spoken aloud in months. A phone call might be overwhelming for both of you." Clara considered this. The idea of hearing her mother's voice, of trying to speak after so long, felt both wonderful and terrifying. But there were other ways to communicate, ways that might feel safer for a first contact. "Could I write her a letter?" Clara wrote. "Or maybe, could you call her first and tell her I'm safe?" "I think that's a perfect approach," Dr. Chen agreed. "I can call Margaret this afternoon, let her know that Emma is safe and receiving excellent care, and ask if she'd like to receive a letter from you. That gives you both time to process the initial contact before deciding how to proceed." The rest of the morning passed in a blur of emotions and tentative planning. Clara worked on a letter to her mother, writing and rewriting her attempts to explain where she had been, how she was healing, and how much she had missed the woman who had taught her to see beauty even in difficult circumstances. Samuel arrived for his usual Friday visit to find Clara transformed, still quiet, still careful, but radiating an energy he hadn't seen before. She showed him Margaret's photograph and shared the morning's revelations through her notebook, watching his face light up with genuine happiness at her progress. "This is extraordinary," Samuel said, studying the photograph. "I can see where you get your artistic talent and your strength. She looks like someone who would move mountains to protect the people she loves." Clara wrote, "She tried to protect me. I protected her by leaving. Now maybe we can protect each other by being together again. Are you ready for that?" Samuel asked gently. "Being together again means eventually leaving Willowbrook, returning to the world outside this protected space." The question gave Clara pause. She had become so accustomed to the safety and routine of Willowbrook that the idea of leaving felt both exciting and terrifying. But she was no longer the broken woman who had arrived here in October. She had tools now, support systems, and most importantly, a voice that was slowly returning to her. "Not yet," she wrote, "but someday, when I'm strong enough to speak again, to tell her what happened, to be her daughter again, instead of just a victim hiding from Derek." That afternoon, Dr. Chen made the call to Margaret Henley while Clara waited in the garden, too nervous to remain indoors, but too invested in the outcome to go far from the building. Samuel sat with her on a bench overlooking the snow-covered flower beds where his spring bulbs lay dormant, waiting for their own season of renewal. When Dr. Chen emerged from the building nearly an hour later, her face was streaked with tears, but her expression was radiant. "She cried for 10 minutes straight when I told her you were safe," she said, settling onto the bench beside Clara. "Then she cried for another 10 minutes when I told her you were healing, that you were painting again, that you were surrounded by people who cared about you." Clara felt her own tears starting again, but these were tears of pure relief and joy. Her mother had spent 3 months in agony, not knowing if her daughter was dead or suffering, and now that agony was ending. "She wants to write to you too," Dr. Chen continued, "and she wants you to know that she's incredibly proud of your strength, that she never stopped believing you would survive whatever you were facing." Clara reached for her notebook. "What did she say when you told her about Derek being in jail?" "She said she had been praying for exactly that outcome, that she had been working with victim advocates to build a case against him, even without knowing where you were. She's been preparing for your return in every way she could think of." The afternoon passed in writing, Clara working on her letter to Margaret, while Dr. Chen helped her think through what she wanted to say and how she wanted to say it. The final version was 3 pages long, covering her gratitude for her mother's love, her regret for the pain her disappearance had caused, and her hope that they could rebuild their relationship as she continued healing. As evening fell, Clara realized that today had been a turning point not just in her recovery, but in her understanding of herself. She wasn't just a victim who had survived trauma. She was a daughter who had made difficult choices to protect someone she loved, an artist who had never truly lost her creativity, and a woman who was finding her way back to her own voice. That night, she sat at her easel working on a new painting, a portrait of 2 women, one older and one younger, their faces turned toward each other in recognition and love. Margaret's features were clearly recognizable, but the younger woman's face was still developing, still becoming, as if the artist couldn't quite decide who she was meant to be. For the first time in months, Clara found herself humming while she painted, not just random melody, but a specific song her mother used to sing while they worked together in the art studio. The words weren't ready to emerge yet, but the melody carried all the emotion she couldn't yet speak: love, gratitude, hope, and the tentative belief that home might be possible again. Outside her window, snow continued to fall on the Willowbrook gardens, but Clara knew that spring would come eventually. The bulbs Samuel had planted were waiting beneath the surface, gathering strength for their eventual emergence into light. Just like her voice, just like her relationship with her mother, just like her sense of who she was meant to become. Everything was preparing for the moment when it would be safe to bloom again. The letters between Clara and Margaret became the bridge that slowly connected 2 hearts, separated by months of fear and silence. Margaret's first letter arrived 3 days after. Dr. Chen's phone call, delivered with the careful ceremony that important correspondence deserved. Clara held the envelope for nearly an hour before opening it, marveling at her mother's familiar handwriting, the same careful script that had labeled paint tubes and written encouraging notes on Clara's childhood artwork. "My dearest Emma," the letter began, and just seeing her real name written in her mother's hand made Clara's eyes blur with tears. "I have thought of you every single day since you disappeared. I have painted your face from memory until I wore out 3 different sets of brushes. I have prayed to every deity I could think of that you were somewhere safe, somewhere you could heal from what Derek put you through." Margaret's letter was 6 pages long, filled with updates about her teaching, descriptions of new art techniques she had learned, and gentle reassurances that Clara should take all the time she needed to heal. But it was the final paragraph that broke something open in Clara's chest. "You saved both of us by leaving when you did. I know how much courage that took, how much love it required to walk away from everything familiar to keep us both safe. You have always been the strongest person I know, even when you couldn't see it yourself. Come home when you're ready, but know that home will be here waiting however long it takes." Clara spent that evening writing her response, pouring 3 months of stored emotion onto paper. She told Margaret about her art therapy with Helen, about Samuel's patient kindness, about the slow process of remembering who she had been before Derek's violence had stolen her voice. She described the painting she had been creating and enclosed a small watercolor sketch of the view from her Willowbrook window. The correspondence continued through January, letters flowing back and forth like a gentle conversation that gradually rebuilt the foundation of their relationship. Margaret shared stories from her classroom, describing students who reminded her of Clara's determination and creativity. Clara wrote about her daily routine at Willowbrook, her growing friendship with other residents, and the small victories in her recovery process. It was in her 4th letter that Clara first mentioned the possibility of speaking again. "I've been humming while I paint," she wrote. Sometimes I catch myself almost forming words, like my voice is testing whether it's safe to come out. Dr. Chen says this is normal, that speech often returns gradually when the nervous system feels truly secure. Margaret's response was immediate and encouraging. I remember when you were 3 and went through a silent phase after a bad fall. You hummed for weeks before you spoke again, as if your voice needed to warm up like an engine. On a cold morning, take all the time you need. I'll be here to listen whenever you're ready to speak. February brought an unexpected visitor to Willowbrook. Dr. Chen knocked on Clara's door one Tuesday morning, carrying news that made Clara's heart race with both excitement and anxiety. Margaret has asked if she could visit, Dr. Chen said carefully. Not to pressure you or rush your recovery, but because she wants to see for herself that you're truly safe and healing. She's prepared to stay in town for as long as you're comfortable having her nearby, with no expectations about when or if you'll be ready to see her. Clara stared at Dr. Chen, processing the magnitude of what was being offered. For months, she had been slowly building toward the possibility of reuniting with her mother, but the reality of Margaret being physically present, of potentially seeing her face to face, felt overwhelming in ways that letters and photographs hadn't prepared. Therefore, she could stay at the inn in town, Dr. Chen continued. Take as much time as you need to decide if and when you want to meet. Helen has offered to facilitate the meeting if you'd like, since you trust her and she has experience helping families. Reconnect after trauma. Clara reached for her notebook, her hands shaking slightly as she wrote, "What if I can't speak to her? What if seeing her makes me remember more about Derek?" "Then we handle whatever comes up together," Dr. Chen replied. "You've built tremendous strength over these months. You're not the same person who arrived here in October. You have tools now, support systems, and most importantly, you have choice about how to proceed." Samuel arrived for his regular visit an hour later to find Clara sitting in the garden, despite the February cold, wrapped in blankets and staring at the dormant flower beds where his spring bulbs waited beneath the frozen ground. She showed him Dr. Chen's news, watching his face carefully for any sign that he thought she wasn't ready for such a significant step. "This is wonderful," Samuel said, settling beside her on the bench they had claimed as their own. "But also scary, I imagine, meeting someone from your previous life while you're still figuring out who you are now." Clara wrote, "What if I disappoint her? What if I'm too different, too damaged from what Derek did to me?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words with the care he always brought to their most important conversations. "Clara, Emma, I've watched you transform over these months. You haven't just healed from trauma, you've discovered strengths and talents you didn't know you possessed. The woman your mother will meet isn't damaged. She's someone who survived something terrible and chose to rebuild herself with grace and determination." He paused, studying her face. "But more importantly, from everything you've shared about her letters, your mother isn't coming here to judge who you've become. She's coming to celebrate the fact that you're alive, that you're healing, that you found the courage to save both of your lives by leaving when you did." Clara spent the next 3 days agonizing over the decision. She painted obsessively, worked in the greenhouse until her hands were caked with soil, and took long walks through Willowbrook's winter quiet gardens while wrestling with her fears and hopes. Finally, on Friday morning, she knocked on Dr. Chen's office door with a folded piece of paper in her hand. "Yes," the note read simply. "Please ask her to come, but slowly. Maybe we could write letters while she's in town before we meet face to face." Dr. Chen smiled, the expression carrying months of accumulated pride in Clara's progress. "That sounds like a perfect plan. I'll call her this afternoon." Margaret arrived in town the following Tuesday, taking a room at the historic Millbrook. In just 3 miles from Willowbrook, She didn't request immediate contact or push for rushed meetings. Instead, she simply sent a note letting Clara know she was nearby and ready whenever Clara felt prepared to take the next step. The knowledge that her mother was so close created a strange energy at Willowbrook. Clara found herself more alert, more aware of her appearance and behavior, as if Margaret might appear around any corner. But it was a hopeful alertness, rather than the hypervigilance that had characterized her early weeks at the facility. Helen suggested they start with what she called parallel presence, activities they could do in the same space without the pressure of direct interaction. "Would you like to try painting while your mother paints nearby?" Helen asked during their Tuesday session. "No conversation required, just the comfort of creating art together the way you used to." The suggestion felt perfect. Clara had been longing to share her artistic progress with Margaret, to show her mother how the painting lessons from childhood had sustained her through the darkest period of her life. They arranged for Margaret to join them in the garden studio Helen had set up for outdoor painting sessions. Thursday afternoon arrived crisp and clear, with the kind of February light that photographers prize for its clarity and warmth. Clara positioned herself at her easel in the garden studio, hands trembling slightly as she prepared her palette. She had chosen to work on a landscape that had been developing for weeks, a view of the Willowbrook Gardens in spring, with the bulbs Samuel had planted blooming in riotous color. Helen arrived first, setting up her own easel with the calm efficiency that had made Clara feel safe from their first meeting. Then, footsteps on the gravel path announced Margaret's approach. Clara kept her eyes on her painting as her mother entered the studio, but she was intensely aware of Margaret's presence. The familiar scent of turpentine and lavender that always clung to her mother's clothes. The soft exclamation of delight as Margaret took in the collection of Clara's recent work displayed around the space. "Oh, Emma," Margaret whispered, and Clara could hear tears in her voice. "These are extraordinary. Look how your technique has developed, how much emotion you're capturing." Clara's brush wavered on the paper, but she didn't look up. Hearing her mother's voice in person, after months of imagining it, felt overwhelming in ways she hadn't anticipated. Margaret's tone carried the same mixture of love and professional appreciation that had characterized Clara's childhood art lessons. "Would it be all right if I painted beside you?" Margaret asked Helen, though Clara knew the question was really directed at her. "I brought my travel easel and supplies." Clara managed a small nod, still focused on her painting but aware of Margaret, setting up her easel a respectful distance away. For nearly an hour, they painted in companionable silence, mother and daughter creating art side by side for the first time in over a year. Gradually, Clara's nervousness gave way to something deeper and more familiar. This was how they had always communicated best, not through words, but through shared creative focus, through the quiet understanding that passed between artists working in harmony. Margaret's presence felt like coming home to a part of herself she had almost forgotten existed. When Clara finally risked a glance at her mother's easel, she saw that Margaret was painting the same spring garden scene, but from her own perspective, across the studio. The two paintings would complement each other, different viewpoints of the same hopeful landscape, just as mother and daughter were approaching their reunion from different angles but working toward the same goal. "I've missed this," Margaret said softly, not looking up from her work. "Painting with you was always my favorite part of any day. I have a studio set up in the apartment now, with an easel waiting for you whenever you're ready to come home." Clara felt something break open in her chest, not the painful breaking that had accompanied her traumatic memories, but the gentle breaking that allowed new growth. Her mother was already preparing for her return, already making space for the artist Clara had become during her months of healing. For the first time since Margaret's arrival, Clara looked directly at her mother's face. Margaret was older than in the photograph Dr. Chen had shown her, more lines around her eyes, grey streaks more prominent in her hair. But her expression held the same patient love that had sustained Clara through childhood, the same unshakable belief in her daughter's worth and potential. Their eyes met across the studio, and Clara felt the last of her protective barriers dissolve. This was her mother, not a threat to be feared or a source of additional trauma, but the person who had taught her to see beauty in the world and given her the tools to survive even the darkest circumstances. Clara set down her brush and reached for the notebook she always carried. With hands that shook only slightly, she wrote a single word and held it up for Margaret to see. "Mom." Margaret's paintbrush clattered to the ground as she covered her mouth with paint-stained hands, tears streaming down her cheeks. She started to rise from her stool, then caught herself, waiting to see if Clara was ready for closer contact. Clara stood first, taking 2 tentative steps toward her mother before Margaret closed the remaining distance between them. Their embrace was tentative at first, then fierce as months of separation and fear dissolved into the simple reality of being together again. "I'm so sorry," Clara whispered against her mother's shoulder, the first words she had spoken aloud since arriving at Willowbrook. Her voice was hoarse from disuse, barely more than a breath, but the words were clear enough for Margaret to hear. "Oh, sweetheart," Margaret whispered back, holding Clara close enough to feel her heartbeat. "You have nothing to apologize for. You saved us both. You are the bravest person I know." They held each other in the garden studio, while afternoon light slanted through the windows, and their abandoned paintings waited on their easels. 2 women who had survived the worst that life could offer and found their way back to each other. Through love, patience, and the healing power of art, Helen quietly gathered her supplies and slipped away, leaving mother and daughter to their reunion. Samuel appeared briefly in the doorway, saw the 2 women embracing, and smiled before retreating to give them privacy. Dr. Chen would later say it was one of the most beautiful moments she had witnessed in her years of trauma recovery work. Clara's voice, when it returned fully over the following days, was different than it had been before. Quieter perhaps, more deliberate, but strengthened by everything she had survived and overcome. She spoke first to Margaret, then gradually to Samuel, Helen, and Dr. Chen, sharing not just words, but the thoughts and feelings she had been storing up for months. The reunion marked the beginning of the final phase of Clara's recovery. Not the end of her healing journey, but the transition from survivor to someone ready to reclaim her place in the world. Margaret extended her stay in Millbrook, spending each day with Clara as they planned for the future and processed the trauma of their separation. By month's end, they were painting together daily, their canvases chronicling not just the approaching spring at Willowbrook, but the gradual blooming of hope that had sustained them both through the darkest period of their lives. Clara's voice grew stronger with each passing day, and with it came the confidence that she was ready to leave the safety of Willowbrook and begin building a new life with her mother. The spring bulbs Samuel had planted months earlier were beginning to show, green shoots above the soil, the first signs that winter's hold was loosening, that renewal was not just possible, but inevitable. Just like Clara's voice, just like her relationship with her mother, just like her sense of who she was meant to become, everything was preparing for the moment when it would be safe to bloom again in the wider world. Spring arrived at Willowbrook, with dramatic flourish, as if nature itself wanted to celebrate the renewal that had been quietly building through the winter months. The bulbs Samuel had planted during Clara's first weeks at the facility burst from the ground in waves of color. Daffodils first, their bright yellow trumpets announcing the end of winter's grip, followed by tulips in every shade from deep burgundy to pale cream. And finally, the delicate crocuses that painted purple and white stripes across the awakening lawns. Clara stood at her window on the first morning of April, watching Samuel kneel among the flower beds he had tended so carefully. But today, he wasn't, working alone. Margaret was beside him, her hands dark with soil as she helped divide perennials and plant new seedlings they had chosen together from the local nursery. Their easy collaboration reflected the friendship that had developed over Clara's final weeks at Willowbrook, a bond forged through their shared love for the woman who was preparing to leave this sanctuary and re-enter the world. The past month had transformed Clara's recovery from a gradual process into something approaching completion. Her voice, once returned, had grown stronger and more confident each day. She now participated fully in group therapy sessions, shared meals with other residents in the common dining room, and had even begun helping Helen teach watercolor techniques to newer patients who were just beginning their own healing journeys. But, perhaps most significantly, Clara had begun planning her discharge from Willowbrook. The process was careful and gradual: weekend visits to Margaret's temporary apartment in town, shopping trips to practice navigating public spaces, and regular meetings with Dr. Chen to ensure her coping strategies remained solid under the stress of transition. "I never thought I'd be nervous about leaving," Clara confided to Samuel as they walked through the gardens together on what would be one of their final Tuesday afternoon visits. "This place saved my life, gave me time to remember who I am. Leaving feels like saying goodbye to the person I became here." Samuel paused beside the fountain that had been installed near the meditation garden, its gentle water sounds creating a peaceful backdrop for difficult conversations. "You're not leaving that person behind," he said thoughtfully. "You're taking her with you. The strength you developed, the voice you reclaimed, the artistic vision that flourished here. Willowbrook was never meant to be permanent. It was meant to give you the tools to thrive anywhere." Clara knew he was right, but the knowledge didn't entirely ease her anxiety about returning to a world that included crowded streets, unexpected noises, and the constant low-level vigilance that life outside protected environments required. Derek's imprisonment had eliminated the immediate physical threat, but trauma recovery included learning to navigate a world that could still feel dangerous even when it was objectively safe. "Will you visit us in Philadelphia?" Clara asked, realizing she had been avoiding this question for weeks. Samuel had become more than her doctor. He was the person who had believed in her recovery when she couldn't believe in it herself, the steady presence who had modeled what patient, unconditional support looked like. "I'd like that very much," Samuel replied, his smile carrying the warmth that had sustained Clara through her darkest moments. "Dr. Chen has already arranged for me to consult on your ongoing care, so you'll be seeing me regularly whether you want to or not." Their laughter attracted Margaret's attention from across the garden. She looked up from the flower bed where she was working, soil streaking her cheek, and waved at them with the enthusiasm of someone who had rediscovered joy after months of worry. The sight of her mother's happiness, genuine, uncomplicated happiness, filled Clara with a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced since before Derek's violence had derailed her life. That evening, Clara's final therapy session with Dr. Chen took place in the comfortable office where so many breakthroughs had been carefully nurtured into existence. The room felt different now, no longer like a place where Clara came to be fixed, but like a space where she had learned to fix herself. "When you first arrived here," Dr. Chen began, reviewing the thick file that documented Clara's journey, "you couldn't speak, couldn't trust, couldn't imagine a future beyond simple survival. Look at who you've become, an advocate for other trauma survivors, an artist whose work captures hope in the midst of pain, a daughter who had the courage to disappear in order to save 2 lives. Clara sat in the chair she had occupied for dozens of sessions, But her posture was completely different from those early days. She sat upright, made direct eye contact, and spoke with the clear voice of someone who had reclaimed her right to take up space in the world. "I keep thinking about that first day," Clara said, "when you told me that healing doesn't follow a schedule. I thought you were just trying to manage my expectations. But you were teaching me that recovery is something I had to participate in actively, not something that would be done to me." Dr. Chen smiled, her expression carrying the satisfaction of a job completed successfully. "You taught me things too, about resilience, about the healing power of art, about how safety can be rebuilt one small choice at a time. Your recovery has been a masterclass in the human capacity for renewal." They spent the session reviewing Clara's discharge plan, ongoing therapy with a trauma specialist in Philadelphia, continued art therapy sessions, regular check-ins with Samuel, and most importantly, a safety plan that included recognizing early warning signs of anxiety or depression and having concrete strategies for managing them. "Remember," Dr. Chen concluded, "recovery isn't about returning to who you were before Derek. It's about becoming who you were always meant to be, informed by your experiences but not limited by them." Clara's final painting at Willowbrook was a group portrait that included everyone who had played a significant role in her healing. Samuel, with his hands full of garden soil, Helen mixing colors on a palette, Maria carrying a tea tray, Dr. Chen holding an open book, and Margaret standing in the center with her arms outstretched as if gathering all of them into an embrace. But the most striking figure in the painting was Clara herself, no longer the frightened woman who had arrived in October, but someone radiant with newfound strength and purpose. The discharge ceremony took place on a Tuesday morning in mid-April, with spring sunshine streaming through the windows of Willowbrook's main common room. Other residents and staff members gathered to wish Clara well, creating the kind of supportive community send-off that the facility was known for providing. Helen presented Clara with a complete set of professional watercolor supplies, the same high-quality materials she had used during their outdoor painting sessions. "For continuing your artistic journey," Helen said, embracing Clara warmly. "I expect to see an exhibition of your work within the year." Maria offered a handmade quilt that featured fabric squares painted by various Willowbrook residents, a tangible reminder of the community that had supported Clara's healing and would continue to cheer for her success. "Every time you feel lonely or scared," Maria said, "wrap yourself in this and remember how many people believe in your strength." Samuel's gift was more practical but equally meaningful. A small emergency kit that included Dr. Chen's contact information, local crisis hotline numbers, and a collection of meditation cards with grounding exercises Clara could use if anxiety threatened to overwhelm her coping strategies. "Think of it as insurance," Samuel explained. "You probably won't need any of this, but having it might help you feel more confident about navigating difficult moments." Dr. Chen's farewell was both professional and deeply personal. "You came here as someone who had survived something terrible," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You're leaving as someone who has transformed survival into wisdom, trauma into strength, silence into voice. The woman walking out these doors today is not the same person who arrived here 6 months ago. She's someone infinitely stronger, wiser, and more capable of creating the life she deserves." Clara's response to their generosity was a speech she had been preparing for weeks, the first extended public speaking she had done since her voice returned. Her words were clear, confident, and filled with gratitude that went beyond simple politeness. "6 months ago, I arrived here broken and silent, convinced that I was nothing more than the trauma I had survived," Clara began, looking around the room at faces that had become beloved and familiar. "Each of you taught me something different, About healing, Samuel showed me that patience and consistency could rebuild trust. Helen demonstrated that creativity could transform pain into beauty. Maria proved that kindness didn't require explanation or justification. And Dr. Chen helped me understand that recovery meant reclaiming my own story, rather than letting trauma write the ending. She paused, gathering courage for the most important part of her message. But most importantly, you all showed me that healing happens in community, that none of us recovers alone. I'm leaving here not just as someone who survived domestic violence, but as someone who knows how to help others survive it too. That's the gift you've given me. Not just my own healing, but the ability to participate in healing others. The room erupted in applause, but Clara wasn't finished. I'm going back to Philadelphia to work with victim advocacy organizations. I want to use my story, my voice, and my art to help other women understand that silence doesn't have to be permanent, that safety is possible, and that the people who hurt us don't get to determine who we become. Margaret stood at the back of the room, tears streaming down her face as she listened to her daughter speak with the confidence and purpose that trauma had temporarily stolen. This was the Clara she remembered from childhood, the girl who stood up for classmates being bullied, who painted portraits of homeless individuals with dignity and respect, who had always believed that art could make the world more beautiful and compassionate. The drive to Philadelphia took 3 hours, winding through mountain roads that gradually gave way to suburban communities and finally to the familiar neighborhoods of Clara's childhood. Margaret had prepared the apartment carefully, creating a studio space with north-facing windows and shelves ready for Clara's growing collection of art supplies and completed paintings. But the most meaningful preparation was the gallery wall. Margaret had created in the living room a collection of Clara's childhood artwork interspersed with photographs from happier times, all carefully preserved during the months of uncertainty about whether Clara would ever come home. I never stopped believing you'd need these someday, Margaret explained as Clara studied the display. Every painting, every school art project, every photograph that showed you creating something beautiful, I kept them all because they reminded me of who you really are underneath whatever Derek tried to make you believe about yourself. Clara's first weeks back in Philadelphia were challenging in ways she hadn't fully anticipated. Simple activities like grocery shopping or riding public transportation required conscious effort to manage anxiety and hypervigilance. But the coping strategies she had learned at Willowbrook proved effective, and her support network extended beyond Margaret to include her new therapist, a victim advocate named Rosa Martinez, and eventually a small but growing circle of other trauma survivors. Samuel visited monthly, officially for medical consultations, but practically to maintain the friendship that had become important to both of them. During his June visit, he brought news that made Clara's transition feel complete. Derek Martinez had been sentenced to 8 years in prison for assault, violating restraining orders and intimidating witnesses. The legal system had finally provided the consequences that his violence had always deserved. "How do you feel about it?" Samuel asked, as they sat in Margaret's apartment studio, surrounded by Clara's newest paintings, works that showed increasing technical sophistication and emotional depth. "Relief, mostly," Clara replied thoughtfully. "Not because I think prison will change him, but because other women are safer now, and because I can stop looking over my shoulder, stop planning escape routes everywhere I go." By autumn, Clara had established a routine that felt both stable and purposeful. She volunteered 20 hours a week with the Philadelphia Coalition Against Domestic Violence, using her artistic skills to create educational materials and her personal experience to support other survivors. She taught art therapy workshops at local shelters, helped women tell their stories through visual expression when words weren't yet accessible. Margaret returned to full-time teaching, but spent her evenings and weekends painting alongside Clara. Their shared creative practice rebuilding their relationship in ways that simply talking couldn't have achieved. They were planning a joint art exhibition for the following spring, mother and daughter exploring themes of survival, renewal, and the healing power of creative expression. Samuel's role in Clara's life evolved from doctor to trusted friend to something approaching family. His own experience of helping Clara heal had changed his approach to all his patients, making him more patient, more willing to trust the gradual process of recovery rather than pushing for quick results. On the anniversary of Clara's departure from Willowbrook, Samuel called with news that brought their story full circle. A new patient had arrived at the facility, a young woman found in circumstances similar to Clara's, silent and traumatized, but showing signs of artistic ability. Would Clara be willing to correspond with her, to share her story as encouragement? That recovery was possible. Clara's response was immediate and enthusiastic. She wrote a letter that evening, including several small paintings as gifts and a detailed account of her own journey, from silence to voice, from victim to advocate, from broken to brilliantly, purposefully whole. "The most important thing I can tell you," Clara wrote to the unknown woman beginning her own healing journey, "is that the silence that protects you now doesn't have to be permanent. Your voice is still there, waiting for the moment when it's safe to emerge. Trust the process, trust the people helping you, and most importantly, trust yourself. You are stronger than whatever brought you to this place, and you deserve every moment of healing that lies ahead." As Clara sealed the letter and prepared to mail it the next morning, she realized that her own story had reached the point she had always been working toward. Not the end of her healing journey, but the beginning of her ability to guide others. Along the same path, outside her studio window, the Philadelphia streetlights reflected off autumn leaves that were preparing for their own season of letting go and renewal. Clara picked up her brush and began a new painting, a landscape that showed a path winding upward through challenging terrain toward a horizon bright with possibility. She was no longer the mute woman nobody wanted. She was Clara, artist, advocate, daughter, friend, and survivor, who had transformed her trauma into a source of strength that could light the way for others still finding their voices in the darkness. Her silence had been broken not by force, but by patient love, not by demand, but by invitation, not by returning to who she had been, but by becoming who she was always meant to be. The painting grew beneath her brush as the night deepened. Each stroke a word in the visual language she had mastered, each color a note in the song her voice now sang freely. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to help others heal, new chances to use her story as proof that recovery was possible, new moments to celebrate the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit. Clara painted until dawn, her voice humming, softly as she worked, creating beauty in a world that had once seemed capable only of causing pain. She was home, not just in Philadelphia, not just with Margaret, but in herself, in her voice, in the unshakable knowledge that she had survived the worst and discovered the best of what it meant to be human. Outside her studio window, the Rocky Mountains stood silhouetted against the pre-dawn sky, solid and enduring as the strength that had carried her from silence to voice, from victim to healer, from broken to brilliantly, purposefully whole. Tomorrow would bring new women seeking their voices, new opportunities to prove that healing was possible, new chances to transform trauma into hope. 5 years had passed since Clara first opened the Denver Trauma Recovery Center's art therapy program, and the results exceeded everyone's expectations. The center had become a model facility, with delegations visiting from around the world to study their innovative approaches to healing through creative expression. Clara's program had achieved a remarkable 87% success rate in helping selective mutism patients regain their voices, a statistic that had attracted attention from the National Institute of Mental Health. The facility now housed 42 residential beds, 6 fully equipped art studios, a music therapy wing that Clara had added in year 3, and a therapeutic garden designed by Samuel, who had relocated to Denver the previous year to serve as the center's director of horticultural therapy. His presence had added another dimension to Clara's work, as they could now offer integrated treatment plans that combined art, nature, and medical care in ways that addressed trauma's impact on both mind and body. Margaret visited quarterly, each trip bringing new supplies and techniques she had discovered in her own teaching practice. At 60, she had taken early retirement to focus on developing educational materials for families supporting trauma survivors. Her book, Loving Someone Back to Voice, A Mother's Guide to Supporting Trauma Recovery, had become essential reading for families navigating similar situations. The center's success had led to unexpected challenges. Clara found herself spending increasing amounts of time consulting with other facilities, training therapists, and presenting at international conferences rather than working directly with survivors. While she valued the opportunity to spread their methods globally, she missed the intimate, transformative moments of one-on-one artistic collaboration. The solution came from an unexpected source. Dr. Chen, now in her 70s but still sharp and innovative, proposed establishing a training institute adjacent to the trauma center. "You've proven the model works," she explained during a visit to review the center's 5-year outcomes. "Now you need to create a systematic way to replicate it, train the trainers, develop standardized curricula, but maintain the individualized approach that makes your work so effective." The Clara Morrison Institute for Trauma-Informed Art Therapy opened on the 10th anniversary of Clara's departure from Willowbrook. The name felt surreal to Clara. Having an institute named after her seemed to belong to someone else's life, not the silent woman who had once sat in emergency room bed 7, unable to speak her own name. The institute's first cohort included 24 students from 12 countries, all experienced therapists seeking specialized training in Clara's methods. Among them was Dr. Yuki Tanaka from Tokyo, who was developing Japan's first domestic violence recovery center, specifically for women who had lost their voices to trauma. "In my culture," Dr. Tanaka explained during their first seminar, "silence is often seen as virtue, which makes it especially difficult for trauma survivors to recognize when their silence has become prison rather than choice. Your work shows how art can bridge that gap, providing expression that doesn't require words but can lead back to speech." Clara found herself energized by the intellectual challenge of articulating methods she had developed intuitively. Teaching forced her to examine her own processes more carefully, to identify the specific techniques that facilitated breakthrough rather than simply hoping for spontaneous recovery. The Institute's curriculum combined theoretical foundations with intensive practical training. Students spent mornings in the classroom learning about trauma's neurological impacts, the relationship between creativity and healing, and the ethical considerations of working with vulnerable populations. Afternoons were devoted to hands-on practice, with students working directly with trauma survivors under Clara's supervision. One of Clara's most promising students was James Rivera, a former emergency room physician who had left medicine after experiencing secondary trauma from working with abuse victims. James brought medical expertise to the artistic process, helping Clara develop assessment tools that could identify when art therapy was facilitating healing versus when it might be triggering additional trauma. "I watched so many women come through our ER," James explained to Clara during a private consultation. Silent, frightened, unable to explain what had happened to them. "I gave them medical care for their physical injuries, But I had no tools for addressing the damage I couldn't see. Your work provides those tools. James's doctoral research project involved developing a standardized protocol for emergency departments to identify trauma-related selective mutism and provide appropriate initial interventions. His work promised to revolutionize how hospitals handled cases like Clara's, potentially preventing the kind of extended institutionalization that had once seemed inevitable for voiceless trauma survivors. The international attention Clara's work was receiving led to invitations she had never imagined. The United Nations invited her to present at their Commission on the Status of Women, where she shared the stage with Nobel laureates and world leaders. Her presentation, titled "The Sound of Silence: How Art Unlocks Trauma Survivors' Voices," was broadcast to audiences in 47 countries. "Silence is not the absence of voice," Clara told the assembled delegates. "It is a voice waiting for safety." When we create environments where expression feels possible, through art, through patience, through unwavering belief in human resilience, we don't just help individuals heal. We strengthen communities, families, and societies by ensuring that every voice has the opportunity to contribute to our collective wisdom. The speech led to funding opportunities Clara had never dreamed possible. The Morrison Foundation, established by a tech entrepreneur whose sister had survived domestic violence, awarded the Institute a $50 million grant to establish satellite programs in 10 major cities across the United States. Each location would offer both direct services to trauma survivors and training programs for local therapists. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. Derek Martinez, now in his 7th year of imprisonment, requested permission to write to Clara. The letter arrived through her attorney, who had handled the legal aspects of Derek's conviction and recommended against any direct contact. Clara spent weeks deciding whether to read Derek's letter. Dr. Chen, consulted by phone, advised caution, but ultimately supported Clara's decision to at least review what he had written, with appropriate support systems in place. The letter, when Clara finally opened it in Samuel's presence, was shorter than she had expected and startlingly different in tone from anything she remembered about Derek. "I know I have no right to contact you, and I don't expect any response. I've been in therapy for 3 years, and I'm beginning to understand the damage I caused, not just to you, but to every woman I hurt with my anger and control. I see your work on the news sometimes, how you're helping other people heal from what people like me did to them. I can't undo what I did, but I want you to know that your voice, the one I tried to silence, is saving people. I'm grateful you survived me. I'm grateful you became who you are despite what I tried to make you." Clara read the letter twice before setting it aside. She felt neither anger nor forgiveness, but rather a kind of closure she hadn't known she needed. Derek's words confirmed what she had always suspected, that his violence had stemmed from his own brokenness rather than any failing on her part. More importantly, his acknowledgement of her work's value felt like a final severing of any remaining connection between her identity and his opinion of her worth. "How do you feel?" Samuel asked gently, studying Clara's face for signs of distress or re-traumatization. "Free," Clara replied, surprised by the simplicity of her response. "Completely free. He doesn't get to haunt my story anymore. He's just someone who happened to me once, not someone who defines me." That evening, Clara painted her most ambitious work yet, a massive canvas depicting hundreds of women from across cultures and time periods, all in the act of speaking, singing, or creating. At the center of the composition was a figure that bore Clara's own features, but transformed, radiant with purpose, surrounded by the visual representation of every voice she had helped recover. The painting took 3 months to complete and became the centerpiece of a retrospective exhibition celebrating the Institute's first graduating class. The show, titled Voices Rising, A Decade of Trauma Recovery Through Art, toured major museums across the country, with proceeds supporting scholarship programs for underserved trauma survivors. Margaret, now 63 and officially the Institute's Director of Family Services, organized special programs for the exhibition that brought together trauma survivors and their families to share stories of recovery and resilience. These gatherings had become Clara's favorite part of her work, moments when the theoretical became deeply personal, when statistics transformed into human faces and voices. During the exhibition stop in Philadelphia, Clara was approached by a young woman who looked familiar, but whom she couldn't immediately place. The woman introduced herself as Emma Patricia Chen, named, she explained, after Clara and Dr. Chen, two women who had saved her mother's life when she was just a child. "My mother is Sophia," the young woman continued, and Clara's memory immediately supplied the context. Sophia, the trafficking survivor, who had been among the Denver Center's first residents, who had added a single figure to Clara's painting and whispered her first word in over a year. "She's Dr. Sophia Martinez now," Emma continued with obvious pride. "She finished her PhD in psychology last year and works with refugee women who've experienced similar trauma. She always says you taught her that survival was just the beginning, that she got to choose who she became after being hurt." The conversation with Sophia's daughter reminded Clara of something Dr. Chen had said during those early months at Willowbrook. Healing happens in ripples, touching lives in ways we may never know or understand. Clara's recovery had enabled her to help Sophia recover, which had allowed Sophia to become a therapist who was now helping other women, who would in turn help still others in an ever-expanding circle of healing and hope. As Clara's 60th birthday approached, a milestone she had once been unsure she would reach, she found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her from the silent woman outside St. Catherine's Church to the internationally recognized expert whose methods were being implemented on 6 continents. The birthday celebration, organized by Margaret and Samuel, brought together people from every phase of Clara's recovery and professional development. Helen Morrison, now 82 but still teaching watercolor techniques via video conference, attended virtually from her assisted living facility. Dr. Chen, walking with a cane but still intellectually formidable, delivered a keynote address about the evolution of trauma therapy. But the most meaningful moment came when the center's current residents presented Clara with a collaborative artwork, a massive mosaic created from thousands of small painted tiles, each one created by a trauma survivor who had found her voice through the program Clara had developed. Standing before the mosaic, Clara could see her own journey reflected in the collective artwork of hundreds of women who had followed similar paths, from silence to voice, from victim to survivor to advocate. The piece would hang permanently in the Institute's main gallery, a testament to the power of community healing and the transformative potential of creative expression. Samuel, now 67, and officially Clara's closest friend as well as professional colleague, offered the evening's final toast. To Clara, who proved that silence is not emptiness, but fullness waiting for the right moment to overflow. To the voice that could not be permanently silenced, and to all the voices that have been freed because one woman refused to let trauma have the final word in her story. As Clara looked around the room at faces representing decades of shared healing work, she realized that her story had become something larger than her individual recovery. It had become proof that trauma could be transformed into purpose, that the worst experiences could generate the most meaningful work, that voices silenced by violence could return stronger and more purposeful than before. The evening ended with Clara returning to her studio, not to paint but simply to sit in the quiet space where so much healing had been facilitated. Outside the windows, the lights of Denver sparkled against the backdrop of the Rocky Mountains, each point of light representing someone who had found their way through darkness to illumination. Clara set down her brush and spoke aloud to the empty studio, her voice clear and strong in the mountain silence. "Thank you." The words encompassed everything: gratitude for survival, for Samuel's patient presence, for Margaret's unwavering love, for Dr. Chen's skillful guidance, for Helen's artistic wisdom, for every person who had believed in her recovery when she couldn't believe in it herself. But most of all, the words were gratitude for the voice that had returned to her, not as it had been before, but as something stronger, more purposeful, more capable of carrying not just her own story, but the stories of every woman who was still waiting to discover that her voice too was worth recovering. In the distance, a nightbird began singing, clear, strong, and unafraid. Clara smiled, recognizing the sound as exactly what she had become, a voice that had emerged from silence, transformed by trial, and dedicated to ensuring that no one would remain voiceless forever. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.